If we were to rate on one of those infamous 1 to 10 scales, the Lincoln-Douglas debates among the top 10 events in American history that just about every American who has not fallen asleep in this auditorium can easily identify. That was a wake-up call, wasn't it? If we were to rate it, we'd probably put the Lincoln-Douglas debates at 6. And of course, everyone's thinking, 6? Wait a minute, he just wrote a book about it. Doesn't he want to sell any? Isn't it the purpose of an author to convince you that the most important thing that has ever been written about is the subject of his book? Well, no, 6, because 1 through 5 in that list of events that sentient human beings can identify in American history are things like Washington crossing the Delaware, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Alamo, Custer's last stand, Washington at Valley Forge. He gets in there twice. So when you think about it, the first 5 events are full of blood, guts, killing, and gore. Really exciting stuff. And then comes the 6th of these events that everybody can recognize, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. What are they? Oh, 2 politicians standing in the open air, speaking for 3 hours at 7 places around Illinois. Yeah, that sounds like it's a real thrill compared to the Alamo. Or unless they one day cast Billy Bob Thornton in the role of Stephen A. Douglas. That's going to be hard because Stephen A. Douglas, one of the 2 protagonists in this event, very strongly resembled the Pillsbury Doughboy without the hat. His opponent, Abraham Lincoln, resembled a scarecrow who had somehow escaped from the cornfield and who spoke in a voice whose pitch closely approximated that of a steam whistle. And yet these debates really have come down as great events in American history. They are described as the great crux of democracy, the great example of democratic exchange in practice. Even the poets have lauded these debates as great events. I'm going to push this. If I blow up, you'll know why. Nothing is happening yet. All right, now I'm going to carry out my threat. I'm going to go here. Aha, there we go. Here are the poets. Here's Stephen Vincent Benet writing about the Lincoln-Douglas debate. Sing ho, those spirited debates, bereft of all restrictions, when statesmen carried on their hips the strength of their convictions. These were the debates that would show you what the power of popular government was. Well, of course, this was an election year. And through this election year, we have had some 20 candidate debates. And when we think about the candidate debates we've seen thus far in the election season, I don't think anyone has been moved to write poetry about them. And we look at the contrast, and it just seems like, things have gotten very different. I mean, compare the Lincoln-Douglas debates with candidate debating today, and what you get is it's going to look terrible. The Lincoln-Douglas debates took place in the open air, 3 hours on each occasion. First speaker would get up and speak for an hour, followed by second speaker talking for an hour and a half, and then the first speaker gets up and delivers a rebuttal of a half an hour. And Lincoln and Douglas traded leadoff places as they went from debate location to debate location. Now today, our debates take place in syllables rather than hours. Candidates will get a few minutes to say what they want to say. And then they're cut off by a moderator, a journalist, usually who wants to stop them from talking so that they can move on to the next person who has to talk. And you get really nothing more than a series of talking points and the contents of a palm card. And that's what we see in our modern debates. Lincoln-Douglas debates took place in front of huge audiences of people. Today's debates take place in a studio, in an auditorium, sometimes with no audience at all. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were consumed not with discussions of policy, but rather they were discussions about one great major issue, slavery and its extension and legalization in the Western territories. And to this one subject, they returned on each occasion. They did not talk about the tariffs. They did not talk about internal improvements. They did not talk about taxation. They talked about slavery. Now, our candidates today talk about a variety of subjects. None of them seem to have much connection to each other, which is because our candidates are appealing to constituencies which don't have much connection to each other. Today, in our debates, we hear people talking about how to fix bad mortgages, how to fix the tax system, whether the candidate's spouse has too much to say. Just imagine if Mary Lincoln was going on the campaign trail with him. And it's almost as though we have come a great ways from talking about great issues to talking about something you would expect to find in the campaign for mayor. As the old television commercial once said, "You've come a long way, baby." And isn't it chilling that we describe the difference between these debates of today and the debates of 1858 in terms of a television commercial jingle? Well, don't panic too much, because there are, in fact, elements of the Lincoln-Douglas campaign and the debates that occurred within that campaign which themselves sometimes appear more than a little familiar, unhappily. There are aspects lurking right beneath the surface of the Lincoln and Douglas debates which will tend to knock them off their pedestal and make them, unfortunately, a little bit more familiar than you might think. And two of those, as I say, lurk right beneath the surface. One of the questions which will really take us down a couple of pegs in considering the Lincoln-Douglas debates is, who won the debates? And the second of those questions is linked to it. Who won the election? And in fact, trying to find answers to those questions, turns out to be a good deal more difficult than you might think. First of all, who won the debates? Answer. Well, the problem here is that there was no scorecard. These were not debates, as you might think of, collegiate, Oxford-style debates, where one side gets up and makes the affirmative statement, and then the other makes the negative statement, and then there's the corresponding affirmative, and then the corresponding negative, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I mean, that you can at least grade on a somewhat objective scale, although even there's still that element of the subjective. Not in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. What the Lincoln-Douglas debates really were sequences of speeches. Douglas made a speech, Lincoln made a speech, and then Douglas made something that was really just another short speech. And then they traded places, and on they went. Now, sometimes it might happen that the two of them would tangentially intersect, because Douglas would notice something Lincoln said, and Lincoln would notice something Douglas said, and they would mention each other. But the fact is, they're making set speeches. They're not really going down a list of points, and they're not rebutting each other in this very careful, collegiate fashion. That's not what's happening. These are really sequence of speeches. There's no umpires. There's no referees. There's no judges. No little bell rings. No microphone descends into the square, and someone is announced as the winner. But even if there was a scorecard for the Lincoln-Douglas debates, who was going to report it? The newspapers that Rod and Doug talked about were, frankly, partisan. In fact, newspapers in Illinois, there were about 160 newspapers in Illinois in the 1850s. They were unashamedly and unapologetically partisan. And this is because, for the most part, newspapers in Illinois were something of a cross between an advertising supplement and a political party newsletter. There might be some reference occasionally to a calamity, a plague, a ship sinking, a steamboat exploding on the Mississippi, but the real goods you were reading in this newspaper were the juicy political gossip goods. That was what the newspaper was about. The editors didn't give a wet slap about printing all the news that was fit to print, because they themselves were usually party officials and party hacks looking to get government printing contracts and hoping for patronage appointments to political office. So you can find accounts of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in rival newspapers, and you will read those accounts and wonder if you're reading a description of the same event. At the Ottawa debate, the Democratic newspapers claim that Lincoln has been so destroyed by Douglas in the debate that his knees buckle His legs fail him. He's ready to faint, and he has to be carried off the platform by his disheartened followers. The Republican newspaper describes how Lincoln has triumphantly devastated Douglas, and that his followers, Lincoln's followers, in a burst of joy, storm the platform, hoist the good fellow on their shoulders, and parade him through the streets. So about the only thing that really is in common is they were talking about Lincoln. Talk about spin. They didn't even need a spin room. They didn't need a media room to do any of this either. This is what was being done in the newspapers. So as you can see from just these examples, in the middle especially, I always loved this one from one of the Douglas papers. They didn't just, on the 5th of November, report the results of the election. They just had to get up and really rub it in people's faces. So there we have Douglas sustained. Lincoln's comb is cut. Take that, Abe. He is brought to his milk. The little giant has spotted him. There's the Mexican War thing. Spotty Lincoln. So, I mean, they're not just reporting here. They're exulting. And it goes this way in all of the newspapers in Illinois. So if you're looking to find out who won the debates, please don't bother reading the Illinois newspapers because they're not going to tell you. It's purely an exercise in partisanship. All right, maybe we should do the numbers. After all, we've had the closing bell. So let's do the numbers and see if the numbers will tell us who won the debates. If we do the numbers, logically we might think that the best measure of whether Lincoln or Douglas won a debate would be the degree of influence they exercised on the people who heard that debate in voting. Now, mind you, of course, there's no exit polls. So let's look at how the surrounding county around the debate sites, each of those 7 counties around the 7 debates, let's look at the voting there and see if that tells us if people were influenced or moved by Lincoln and Douglas to vote in a certain way. So what do we do? Let's look at the county around Ottawa. The voting there goes in the Republican direction. Same for Freeport, and Jonesboro, and Charleston, and Galesburg. So we would say that Lincoln won 5 debates based on the county voting results. Then we would say that Douglas won Quincy and Alton based on the county voting results. Yeah, that tells you what the numbers are, but almost everything on there is utterly counterintuitive. For one thing, Lincoln's performance at Ottawa was a non-starter. For another thing, Jonesboro was about as solidly rib-rocked a Democratic area as one could wish for. And at Quincy and Alton, Lincoln very clearly cleans up the floor with Douglas. So we're looking at numbers that tell us the opposite of what we would find in the debates themselves. Furthermore, as we expand our survey of the numbers start to change, which numbers are not supposed to do. We all learned that in 4th grade, didn't we? So let's look at the State House district surrounding each of the debate sites. Now we start to see the numbers shift. If we look at the State House district, then we would have to say that Lincoln won 4 and Douglas won 3 of the debates. But we still haven't gotten rid of that counterintuitive Ottawa or the counterintuitive Quincy and Alton. All right, let's shift to the even larger focus, and that is to the surrounding U.S. congressional district. There were 9 congressional districts in Illinois, and there were 7 of the debates, and look at the congressional district returns surrounding each one of the debate sites. Lincoln is now down to 3, Douglas is up to 4. We still haven't gotten rid of the counterintuitive. And we have shifted this way. Now, if you look at that, and you see in that a pattern, please come up here and finish this talk for me. Because you're smarter than I am. So who won the debates? Well, most of our ways of measuring this sort of thing are really not telling us very much. All right, let's move on to the second question then. Who won the election? Well, here's a problem too. Because strictly speaking, nobody in 1858 was voting for Lincoln or Douglas. United States senators were not directly elected by the people until 1912. This means that what was happening in 1858 was that people in Illinois were voting for Republican or Democratic members of the state legislature, members of the state House, members of the state Senate, who would in turn vote for Lincoln or Douglas. Now, you might think in this respect that this should be a relatively predictable kind of thing, that you would be able to say that, well, someone who is voting for a Democratic state representative knows that by extension they're voting for Stephen A. Douglas. Well, no, not necessarily, because this is the moment at which local issues elbow their way in. And if a particular Democratic state representative or Democratic candidate for the state legislature has annoyed people in the district, it doesn't matter if he's pledged to Stephen A. Douglas, they're not going to vote for him. And vice versa for Republicans. And this is all across the state. So do you have a recognizable pattern? Do you have a predictable pattern as to who won simply on the basis of how the state legislative elections turn out? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Then you also have the problem of who voted in this election. I mean, even before you can answer the question of what kind of voting took place, you have to understand who actually voted to send people here to the state capitol. Well, here's some more numbers. In just about every account of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in virtually every biography of Lincoln or Douglas, the numbers that are used to tally up the voting in the 1858 state election go by the numbers that appear in Horace Greeley's Political Almanac. Now, Horace Greeley's Tribune Almanac is one of the great mainstays of numbers. You go to it for numbers. It shows you what the election results all across the country were. You go to that the way that people go to the Time Almanac or the World Almanac today for numbers. The one difficulty about this is that the numbers reported for 1858 in Illinois are only the numbers for the state offices, two state offices being directly voted upon by the people, state treasurer and state superintendent of education. Two really thrilling races. The results, to take the state treasurer numbers, are these. The Republican candidate pulls in 125,000 votes. The Democratic candidate pulls in 121,000 votes. So by extension, historian after historian, biographer after biographer assume that, well, this would have been the same kind of vote for people in the state legislature and therefore would have been the same kind of vote for Lincoln and Douglas. So this becomes a surrogate direct vote, so to speak. And it's wrong. In fact, if you consult the original vote ledgers in the archives of the Secretary of State's office in Springfield, Illinois, I'm saying that as though you can just kind of, go to the public library and pull it down. What you find is that instead of a total of 247,000 votes being cast in these legislative elections, there were, for the state House seats, in fact, 366,000 votes being cast, plus another 99,000 for the state Senate seats. If you go by the numbers that are most commonly published, then the election is something of a squeaker between Lincoln and Douglas, or at least between Lincoln and Douglas candidates. If you look at the actual numbers, Lincoln should have cleaned Douglas's clock. Because the numbers for voting for Democratic candidates show a wide disparity, especially in the state Senate voting for Republican candidates. So if we're working on the assumption that if you vote for a Republican or a Democrat for the state legislature, you're voting for Lincoln or Douglas, then we would have to say that Lincoln should have won this election and won it decisively. But he didn't. And the reason he didn't was because of the way that the legislature was apportioned. The apportionment of representation in the legislature, based on the 1854 Legislative Apportionment Bill, granted an overweight of representation to the southern and largely Democratic districts of Illinois, rather than to the northern and Republican districts. In fact, during the campaign, Lincoln addresses this issue of the apportionment. After the election, one of the major things he says that his friends have to do is to fix the apportionment through the legislature. So, the result is that when the state legislature assembles, despite the fact that Republican electors have gotten way, way, way more votes than Democratic ones, they've gotten them in the wrong places. And so when the legislature does convene on January 5th, 1859, the vote goes 54 for Douglas, 46 for Lincoln. Oh, yeah, that's a great example of the voice of the people in democracy, isn't it? It's a good thing that nothing like that has ever happened in American politics since. Yeah, it didn't happen in Florida in 2000, did it? Oh, yes, yes. Something of a perennial difficulty. Something of a perennial difficulty. Well, unfortunately, that's not just those two things. Who won the debates, who won the election. Those are not the only difficulties in comparing now and then with these elections. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the atmosphere of Lincoln and Douglas, contrast it with the atmosphere of candidates today. You see the candidates who are debating. You see them at their rallies. And yes, there's a lot of hooing and hawing and hooraying and people with big placards, usually with the candidate's name. Some of them so big that you think they're trying to be read from the space shuttle. But it's usually pretty sedate by comparison. Now, in Lincoln and Douglas's debates in their campaigns across the state, it's very different. It is interactive democracy, you might say. Yeah, in the same way that vaudeville theaters used to have interaction with the audiences, especially if the acts were no good. At Freeport, someone threw a melon at Douglas, hit him on the shoulder and bounced off. Douglas would bait the crowd. And then when they responded with heckling, he'd bait them back again. I know the shoe is pinching you. I know I've got Lincoln in a corner. I'm going to show you I know your mob methods. Can you imagine John McCain doing that? My goodness. So the atmosphere it's combatively interactive between the audience and the candidates. Now, mercifully, Lincoln and Douglas themselves don't actually slug it out at any point. But at the Charleston debate, that issue about the Mexican War comes up, and it's volatile enough that Lincoln turns on his heel, walks to the back of the platform, picks up Orlando B. Ficklin by the lapels of his coat, because Ficklin had been in Congress and knew what the real story about Lincoln's vote on the supplies and the soldiers was. He marches Ficklin to the apron of the stage and makes Ficklin say, that's right, yeah, that's what Mr. Lincoln says, yeah. Ooh, that could have gotten smart. Of course, they were really much too polite to let it descend below that level, but at other places in Illinois during the campaign, because there were other elections going on, people decided that since Lincoln and Douglas were debating, they were going to do the same thing. Some of those debates were more raucous. At one debate in the north of the state, one candidate for the legislature impugned the honor of his Republican opponent, whereupon the Republican opponent slugged his opposition and knocked him off the platform. That was another kind of debate, wasn't it? If atmosphere in 1858 looks a lot like modern-day things, there are other aspects of the campaign which have a modern ring to them, too. One is the race card. You didn't think they had a race card then, but they did. And Douglas demagogically played the race card as strenuously as it could be played. Not only Douglas, but Douglas's followers. Because Lincoln was opposed to the extension of slavery, said Douglas, then Lincoln has to be for immediate abolition, then he has to be for immediate equality, and if we get immediate equality, then there's going to be an African American in every voting, in every election, an African American in every jury, and Lord help us all, there's going to be amalgamation of the sexes. And this was featured on banner after banner. There was a banner at Charleston by some Douglasites in which was pictured under the heading, Negro Equality, a white man, a black woman, and a black child. Dink, dink, dink. Oh, that's what it's about. And it got even more explicit. At the Galesburg debate, a number of this is from your hometown, guys. You got something to answer for here. At the Galesburg debate, a number of the women who turned out in special dresses made to have Douglas mottos stitched on the skirts. The Douglas motto they stitched on their skirts was, "White men or none." Isn't that a face you could love? I wonder if Stephen A. Douglas was looking to take advantage of that particular gender card. But, you know, it has to be said that Lincoln had a gender card to play, too, a little less demonstrative. At the Charleston debate, there were 32 young Republican ladies who were displaying a banner. And the banner displayed this kind of subtly erotic interest in Lincoln. "Westward the star of empire takes its way. The girls link on to Lincoln as their mothers did to Clay." All right, so this is 1858, all right? You get the message. Well, if not the race card or the gender card, well, how about hanging chads? All right, maybe not hanging chad, but at least voter fraud. One of the great bugaboos that possesses Republicans and haunts even Lincoln is the specter of the Illinois Central Railroad. Well, it's not because of the Illinois Central Railroad per se, although the railroad did its level best to favor Douglas at every point. The great fear was that the Illinois Central Railroad commanded a large workforce, a large mobile workforce up and down the rail lines across the state of Irish immigrants. And as every upstanding former Whig, nativist, know-nothing Republican knew, the Irish were incapable of understanding democracy. Therefore, the Illinois Central would deploy gangs of Irish workers on Election Day to go stuff ballot boxes in key districts. And when the election was over, indeed, there were a number of Republicans who told Lincoln he had lost because of the colonization of the Irish. William Herndon said that the reason we lost the election was because of the illegal intervention of thousands of bloated, pockmarked Irish. And me mother's maiden name was Kerrigan, too. Thank you. So there's the immigrant. There's the illegal alien issue in 1858. And then we finally come to the October surprise. You didn't think there was an October surprise in 1858? Well, so long as there's been an October in American politics, there have been surprises. And the surprise came in this way. The key block of voters that Lincoln and Douglas were pitching to were the mid-state moderates, the old ex-Whigs of the Whig belt in mid-state. These were the people that had always turned out loyally for Henry Clay. And Henry Clay, of course, is now dead, died in 1852. But his heir apparent in the Senate, John Jordan Crittenden of Kentucky, one of the ex-Whigs who had endorsed Douglas, Judge Theophilus Lyle Dickey, in July of 1858 solicited an endorsement letter from Crittenden endorsing Stephen A. Douglas. Dickey and Douglas sat on this letter from the beginning of July until the 19th of October and then published it in the Illinois newspapers. Oh, the Illinois State Register this was the Lincoln paper in Springfield, just about lost it. Where has this letter been all this time? Why have they been hiding it all this time? As if they didn't know. It was too late for Lincoln to undo the damage. Crittenden's letter had tremendous weight with the mid-state old-line Whigs. And again, many people advised Lincoln after the election that he had lost because of the Crittenden letter released at the last moment just 2 weeks before Election Day. And you thought things like this didn't happen in the age of Lincoln, right? Wrong. This is American politics. And yet, having said this, I don't want you to swing to the other extreme and think that what happened in 1858 was really nothing more than politics as usual in the good old American fashion. Because there really is something of great substance that does go on in these 7 debates and the campaign around them. Really, they come down to this issue. The issue is, what is the purpose of a democracy? I mean, they start out talking about slavery, but by the time they get to that 7th debate, what they really are pushing each other to do is to ask, what is a democracy about? And they do it in this way, because Douglas really believed, Stephen A. Douglas really believed, that he was defending democracy. Except that for Douglas, what democracy meant was process. What you have to protect is the process. And if 51%, if a majority in a society want to do something, then so long as that majority is there, they should be free to do it. That's popular sovereignty, where the majority wins. Lincoln had a different view. Lincoln's view was this: democracy, you see, for Douglas, democracy is an end in itself. But for Lincoln, democracy is a means. It's a noble, it's a right, it's a pure means, but it's still a means towards the end of realizing the natural rights described in the Declaration of Independence. And democracy is the best vehicle that humanity has for realizing those natural rights. But those natural rights are hardwired into everybody. You don't take a referendum on those natural rights. A majority, a 51% majority, does not decide whether somebody has the right to life or liberty or the pursuit of happiness. That's a non-negotiable. There are many things, Lincoln said, there are many things the popular government does and does rightly, but there is a line you cannot cross. And that line is drawn around the natural rights that all of us have hardwired into us by our Creator. And those are non-negotiable. And the great offense of slavery for Lincoln was that slavery set those natural rights at naught. Slavery crossed that line? No, doesn't cross it. It trampled across that line. And Douglas allowed them to do it because 51% of the people in a territory might, by popular sovereignty, say it's okay. And Lincoln says that is never okay. That is not what the purpose of a democracy is. The purpose of a democracy is to help us do not what a majority clamors for. The purpose of a democracy is to help us do what is right. And knowing that, he said at the end of the Cooper Union speech, let us boldly dare to do our duty. For Douglas, the only problem about the slavery controversy was that it was a controversy and it was upsetting people. For Lincoln, the problem with the slavery controversy was slavery, because slavery was a violation of natural right. It smashed down everything that the American Revolution had been built upon, everything that the American experiment was dedicated to. And that was why he had to oppose the extension of slavery. That was why he had to condemn slavery not just as inconvenient, but wrong. And that left a decided difference between Lincoln and Douglas in defining the purpose of democracy. We come back to these debates because, in fact, these debates are about us. We have not yet come, as Americans, to a final resolution of what we think the purpose of our democracy is. The issues have changed. The policies have changed. But there continues to be this fundamental controversy in the American mind between those two principles, between those two spirits, those two definitions of what a democracy is about. In this election year of 2008, I do not believe that we will completely sell this debate. Given the way we structure our candidate debates, I'm not even sure it will come up, but it will be there lurking beneath the surface. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates, yes, they do remain important to us. They were about the issues of 1858. But they were also about the issues which still address us and confront us and challenge us as Americans and as participants in a people's government, in a democracy. And so 150 years after the great debates, Lincoln and Douglas still invite us up on the platform with them. Thank you very much.